Borthakur IAS Academy প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা Borthakur IAS Academy.
This is Funny. Welcome to Borthakur IAS Academy. This is our daily Hindu analysis class for 14th September 2021. Let us begin with the first article today. India US to tie up on green energy. Before going into this article, let us understand two things specifically. One is the nationally determined contributions and net zero emissions or net zero. First, let us discuss nationally determined contribution. So, NDCs are nothing but the Paris Agreement, right, which every country, most of the countries signed, requires each country to outline and communicate their post-2020 climate actions. This document, which is released by each and every respective country that is a signatory to Paris Agreement, is called as nationally determined contributions. Now, what it embodies is, it is essentially each country saying that they are going to reduce their national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change and how they are going to achieve those goals that they have set themselves for. Right. According to Paris Agreement, it is required that each country that they should prepare, and not only do that, they have to communicate it and also maintain successive nationally determined contributions that a country intends to achieve. Right? They have to communicate it, and they have to also communicate the actions that they have taken in their bid to reduce their greenhouse emissions, that is greenhouse gases. And at the end of the day, the goal is they have to reach the goals that they have set themselves for by or through Paris Agreement. Now, the idea is that they are being self-accountable, meaning they are going to set their own goals by themselves, and while doing so, while trying to achieve, they are also going to communicate with other members of the Paris Agreement on the processes or the methodologies that they have adopted to achieve their goals. Now, during COP21 of the UNFCCC, where Paris Agreement was signed, certain NDCs were submitted. Particularly, we'll discuss about the Chinese NDC targets, the United States, the European Union, and particularly India's too. So what China said was, their NDC was that they targeted a 60 to 65% reduction of greenhouse gases that they emit. What was the NDC of United States? They aimed to reduce greenhouse gases by 26 to 28%. Similarly, European Union also came out and said that they are also going to reduce their greenhouse gases or greenhouse gas emission by 40%. Now, this is where India's target is interesting. Now, India announced 3 major voluntary commitments. Remember, these NDCs are non-binding. They are voluntary. Each country comes out for themselves and they set their own goals. This is entirely voluntary. Nobody is forcing anybody. Now, India has announced 3 major voluntary commitments that we called as our nationally determined contribution. Number 1, improving the emissions intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 over compared to 2005 levels. That was number 1. Number 2, increasing the share of non-fossil fuels, meaning electricity based or hydrogen based or any other technologies that are non-fossil fuel, and we were trying to increase them to 40% by 2030. The third one is enhancing its forest coverage, thereby absorbing 2.5% to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So this is what India has set as its own commitments for nationally determined contributions. So that is NDCs. Now let us understand what net zero emissions are. See, this go hand in hand with the NDC commitments. Net zero is nothing but being able to achieve an overall balance between the amount of greenhouse gases that a country produces, right, and the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions that it can reduce from the atmosphere, meaning it can remove from the atmosphere by any means and necessary. So you are achieving a equilibrium. Let us say you put out 100 kgs of carbon into the atmosphere. You should have the ability and the capability and the technology and the forest coverage to take out 100 kgs of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So at the end of the day, the amount you release into the atmosphere is equally being absorbed by your either technologies or forests. So that is what net zero is. There is an equilibrium. You are maintaining an equilibrium. That is what net zero emissions means. So this is what this article talks about. Recently we also discussed an editorial where the author was himself saying that it is high time for India to commit to net zero emissions. But what were the hindrances that we were talking about there? No amount of forest coverage, or at least one is the development trajectory that we are in right now and that we want to achieve in the next few decades or so. No amount of forest coverage can essentially take out the amount of greenhouse gases that India is going to emit. That is one hurdle. The second hurdle is the technologies that are currently in use to harvest carbon or to absorb carbon from the atmosphere are highly expensive and cost prohibitive. For a country like India, it really becomes hard to invest into those kinds of infrastructure projects when you are still suffering from basic nutritional needs. So again, there is a correlation there, but at the end of the day, the trajectory, meaning the growth that we anticipate and we desire in the future, doesn't align with the net zero emission goal. But during the same editorial, we also discussed how advantageous it is for India to use this as a potential growth tool, because we discussed that the investment in energy technologies is going to be so huge, and India is rightly poised to tap into those markets and investments, not portfolios but investments. So that is what net zero emissions is. We have also discussed how India is not non-committal on net zero emissions, right? But we also discussed it is in India's best interest to commit to net zero. But as far as India is concerned, currently we have not committed to net zero emissions. So now let us come back to the article with the understanding of what NDCs are and what net zero emissions are. So John Kerry has been designated or appointed as the US climate envoy for the United States government, and he was in India recently to engage with the Indian government in terms of climate change and the fight against climate change. So as far as right now is concerned, the United States government and Indian government are going to collaborate towards installing of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. And not only that, we have already installed power capacity that is being generated through solar. In terms of the total capacity, it currently stands at 476 gigawatts, but we are expecting, or we are hoping to raise it to at least 820 gigawatts by 2030, and this project of 450 gigawatts will certainly help in reaching that goal. See, India and US are going to closely collaborate and coordinate in terms of climate change. This was particularly important because in this meet we launched the climate action and finance mobilization dialogue. This is kind of important because this is one of the main tracks of the US India engagement agenda, right? Particularly the US India Agenda 2030 partnership that both our Prime Minister and the US President announced during April 2021 Leaders Summit on Climate Change, particularly climate. Now, These are the two things. One, we are going to collaborate on installing power capacity, renewable energy, particularly by 2030. Not only that, we have launched a climate action and finance mobilization dialogue, and not only that, we are also going to the US is also closely coordinate with Indian government in funding and providing technology for fight against climate change and develop a kind of an environment friendly technologies, particularly fund environmentally friendly technologies for in India. So again, he was also pointing out to the fact that India has not yet committed or has not given strong indications towards its willingness to commit itself to net zero emissions. But we discussed in earlier article why India is still skeptical, but we also discussed why it is advantageous for India to commit itself to net zero goal. Moving on to the next article, talking amid conflict. So let us explore the US-China relation to a little extent to get an understanding of how China is dealing or engaging with the US, and also comparing it with how China is engaging with India. See, currently US and China are engaged in a trade war. Not only trade war, in terms of the South China Sea, they are also engaged with each other, in the sense that both are challenging the status quo of each other's doctrines. See, since President Trump or Trump administration announced a trade war with China, things have been deteriorating over a period of time. Particularly the US-China relation or relations have been in a free fall for the past 5 years, and the knock-on effect began with the trade war that was announced or launched by Trump administration. When the Biden administration came to power in the United States, everybody agreed, particularly both the Chinese and the Americans agreed that there needs to be a point where they have to get their relationship right, in the sense that the Biden administration wanted something that was a balance act, in the sense that they wanted a competition with the Chinese but not conflict. And as far as the Chinese side, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, has also agreed that both sides needed to get the relationship right, in the sense that there should be mutual respect between both the nations, in the sense that we have to respect each other's interests. But what has been happening is the US policy on China is something that worries China. Right, that has been the point of friction between both the countries. What China wants is China wants US to toe their line, the Chinese line. What US wants is US wants China to toe their line. So that is where majority of the friction, majority of the conflict comes from. Now, one of the hallmarks of Biden administration is their broader approach in terms of competition with China. Their entire policy is oriented towards one thing and one thing only. Wherever it is possible to compete with China, we are going to compete with China. But wherever it is necessary for us to cooperate with China, we are going to cooperate. Listen to my words. Wherever it is possible to compete or needed for competition with China, we are going to compete with China. But wherever we need the Chinese cooperation, we are going to explore the cooperation path with China. So that is what the broader approach was. The broader approach of competing with China where required, but cooperating where possible. So again, this is the dichotomy of the Biden administration in terms of the Chinese policy. There is no hard end or hard stop to Chinese actions. On one hand, they are saying that we are going to compete with China. On the other hand, they are accusing of human rights violations. On the other hand, they are saying that whatever you are doing in Hong Kong, the Taiwan, the South China Sea, these are all against our principles and our rules-based world order. And these are the issues that both sides have been clashing on. And this is something that of a sore point in the relations between both the countries. One of the biggest contentious issues that China has, or the outstanding issues that China has with American side, is the inquiry into origins of COVID-19. Remember, the first country that started this entire thing of asking for an independent inquiry into origin of COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 virus is Australia. The moment Australia started this thing, immediately the US also picked up this thing. They started propagating that. They started talking about the lab leak theory, and they started asking for an independent inquiry, a impartial, a clear, and then very open inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, which China is very, there is no other word for it. China is very angry about it. So the conflict that both the countries share kind of extended into their bilateral meets also, where two lists of demands were exchanged or were given to the US by the Chinese, and one of the items that that was included in the list was unconditionally revoking visa restrictions on Communist Party members, and withdrawing an extradition request of Meng, who happens to be the chief financial officer of the tech firm Huawei, who is on a trial in Canada. This is the interesting thing. China doesn't want any of their Communist Party members to be sanctioned, to have their visas have restrictions on. Again, they are trying to give a list of things. Particularly, they gave a huge two lists to the United States, asking them to consider them and adhere to them, to take back a relationship in the right direction. But again, US is very unlikely to agree with the Chinese conditions, because what China is asking for is unacceptable to the US side. Look at the things. US has imposed sanctions on the Communist Party members based on their actions in either the in regards to the Uyghur Muslims, or in regards to the Hong Kong, or in regards to South China Sea. It's an entirely human rights issue. Given the current climate in US, particularly post Afghanistan, where the human rights issue is a touchy subject, they are not going to give out any leeway to the Chinese in this regards. As far as the state of relations is concerned, the current state or the current status quo is going to continue for a prolonged period of time, until unless something drastically changes either on the Chinese side or on the US side, which is very unlikely given the current circumstances. Now see, what they are trying to do here, the Chinese, what they are trying to do here in terms of American relations is, they have preconditions. See, what they are saying is, if US wants a better relation with China, US has to adhere to the preconditions that the Chinese government has set for US. That is where the two lists of demands come from. What essentially the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese government is saying to US is, we gave you two demands, a list of demands. First, complete those conditions, adhere to those preconditions. Then we will talk about bettering our cooperation, bettering our bilateral relation, and then we will talk about trade, commerce, and everything. Contrast to Chinese stance to Indian side, currently we know India and China are at a standoff in the Ladakh area. The crisis is still ongoing the crisis is still very much active. But despite having a standoff, a military standoff with us, with India, the Chinese side have been saying that India must look things from different perspective, right? They have been very critical of our policy towards China. What was our policy towards China? We are saying that first resolve the border issue, then only we will talk about a trade or anything else. Without resolving the outstanding border issue and the crisis, India is not going to engage with China on trade or, matter of fact, any other thing. To this, what China's response has been, they have been asking us to look at things objectively, meaning you have to differentiate and compartmentalize things. They are saying that despite having a conflict, let us cooperate in terms of trade and commerce and have a better relation in those areas, even though we have an active and a hot border between both of our nations. Look at the contrast here. With the American side, they gave preconditions. They said, first follow those preconditions, complete the list of demands we gave, then only we'll talk about trade, commerce or any other thing with the US side. Now look at what they are saying with the Indian side. Yes, we know that we have an border issue with you, but that is for something to be discussed later. Why are you letting it spoil a relation in terms of trade and commerce? So this is kind of the duality that they have adopted. They want cooperation on trade and other fronts, but they are not willing to solve the LAC. For us, LAC issue is the primary focus. First we are saying solve it, then only we will say we'll talk about cooperation on trade and other fronts. So this is kind of the duality or dual mind or dual stance that China has approached. On the Indian side, in terms of border issue, they are very rigid. With the US side, in terms of the sanctions, in terms of the criticism that American government is giving to the Chinese government on human rights violations, they are very critical of it. They are rigid of it. They don't want to hear any of these things. So the issue which kind of started as a trade war was not the starting point. The outstanding issues were always there. All the trade war did was it brought the underlying issues to the surface, particularly the human rights violations, particularly the competition. So what the Biden government wants is not what the Beijing wants, the Chinese government wants. What China is asking for from the US government is unacceptable to the US government. As I said, the relation between China and America is going to stay as status quo. Nothing is going to change. A major rejig or a major jerk, nothing is going to come out of it until unless something drastic happens on either of those two parties, either on the Chinese side or on the American side. Given the current scenario in both of those countries, the status quo is going to be the same. At the end of the day, as far as how India and China are going to engage in the future, as long as the border issue is there, which is getting dragged on endlessly, the scenario is going to be the same. We are going to have two fronts where we have adversaries staring down at us. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
বৰঠাকুৰ IAS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা। Borthakur IAS Academy।